There is a garden sitting somewhere in your neighborhood right now that has been producing food every single year since before your parents were born. No replanting, no starting over, no buying new seedlings every spring. The person who planted it is long gone, and the garden is still feeding people. Strawberries coming back in May. Asparagus shooting up in April. Fruit trees dropping harvest in August. Herbs spreading wider every season. A fig tree that nobody planted twice. And the neighbor walking past it every day has no idea they are looking at the most financially devastating idea the seed industry ever let slip into public knowledge. Because if enough people understood what perennial food plants actually are, the annual bedding plant market, worth over $4 billion in the United States alone, would collapse inside a single generation. Here is the number that should make you stop everything. The average American gardener spends between $200 and $600 every single spring buying seeds and seedlings for plants that will die the moment the first frost arrives. Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, cucumbers, beans, all of them annual plants that complete their entire life cycle in one season and leave you with nothing but a bare bed and an empty wallet in October. You do that for 30 years of home ownership, and you have spent somewhere between $6,000 and $18,000 buying the same plants over and over again. Plants that a seed catalog convinced you were the only option. They were not the only option. They were just the most profitable option for the people selling them. Before agriculture industrialized, before seed companies existed, before garden centers became the default answer to the question of what to grow, virtually every family food garden in the world was built around perennial plants. Plants that die back in winter and return stronger in spring. Plants whose root systems survive underground for decades while the tops regenerate season after season. Plants that produce more food in year 5 than year 1, more in year 10 than year 5, and more in year 20 than year 10. The Romans grew them. Medieval peasants depended on them. Indigenous communities across every continent built their food security around them. And somewhere between 1945 and 1970, the industrial seed trade quietly buried the concept under 40 years of catalog marketing and made an entire generation forget that plants could outlive the gardener who planted them. Let me show you exactly what was lost and exactly how to get it back starting this season with almost nothing. The most underplanted perennial food plant in the Western world is one you have walked past in grocery stores your entire life without understanding what you were looking at. Asparagus. A single asparagus crown planted in the ground this spring will produce edible spears every year for the next 30 to 40 years. Not 30 to 40 seasons if you are lucky. 30 to 40 years is the standard documented lifespan of a productive asparagus bed. University of California agricultural extension data shows that a well-maintained asparagus bed produces between 2 and 4 pounds of spears per plant annually once fully established. Plant 20 crowns in a row 8 feet long, and you have a harvest that arrives every April like clockwork for 4 decades without you ever touching a seed packet. The catch is patience. Year 1 and 2 you do not harvest. You let the ferns build the root system. Year 3 you get a light harvest. Year 4 the bed hits full production, and then it simply never stops. That patience is exactly what the annual seed industry is betting you do not have. Because if you are willing to wait 2 years, you never need to buy asparagus plants again in your lifetime. What is happening in the soil beneath a perennial plant is something the fertilizer industry deeply prefers you never think about for too long. Annual plants spend the majority of their energy producing seeds quickly because their entire biological mission is reproduction before winter kills them. They are in a permanent state of emergency, converting every resource into fruit and seed as fast as possible. A perennial plant has no such urgency. It knows winter is coming and knows it will survive it. So instead of burning every resource on seed production, it invests heavily in its root system, building an underground network that pulls nutrients and moisture from deeper in the soil than any annual plant can reach. By year 3, the root system of a well-established perennial herb or fruit plant is reaching 18 to 30 inches deep, accessing water reserves that annual plants with their shallow roots never touch. This is why perennial gardens survive drought conditions that destroy annual vegetable beds. The roots are already where the water is. Comfrey is the plant that professional permaculture designers call the workhorse, and that almost nobody in conventional gardening has ever heard of. Plant one comfrey root cutting in the ground, And within 2 growing seasons, you have a plant with a taproot reaching 6 feet deep. That root mines calcium, potassium, and phosphorus from subsoil layers far below the reach of anything else in your garden. Cut the leaves and lay them on your beds as mulch, and those deep minerals transfer directly into your topsoil. Cut it again 2 weeks later because Comfrey regenerates so aggressively that most growers cut it 4 to 6 times per season, and it simply grows back thicker each time. It is a free fertilizer factory that you plant once and that operates without any input from you for the next 20 years. Russian botanist and plant breeder Lawrence Hills documented Comfrey's nutrient profile in research that showed its leaves contain higher concentrations of potassium than almost any commercial fertilizer available, mined from 6 feet underground and delivered to the surface for free every 2 weeks, all season long. The question I want you to answer in the comments right now is this: how much money have you spent buying seeds and seedlings this year alone? Drop the number. No judgment. I genuinely want to know because I think the answer is going to surprise people. Rhubarb is a plant that behaves so differently from everything the modern garden center sells that most people who grow it describe the experience as slightly unreal. You plant a crown once. In year 2, it produces. In year 5, it produces so much that you are giving stalks away to people who did not ask for them. A mature rhubarb plant needs to be divided every 8 to 10 years because it has grown so large and so vigorous that it is competing with itself. That division gives you new crowns to plant or give away. The original plant never stops producing. It is as close to a perpetual harvest machine as anything in the edible plant world, and it disappeared from most American gardens in the mid-20th century almost entirely because it cannot be sold as a new product every spring. Here is the piece of this story that the seed industry really hopes stays buried. Most of the perennial food plants that sustained pre-industrial families across Europe and North America are not just productive, they are medicinal, pest-resistant, soil-building, and deeply integrated with the local ecology in ways that annual monocultures never can be. Egyptian walking onions, a perennial allium that reproduces itself by dropping new bulb clusters at the top of each stalk, have been documented in continuous cultivation in North American homestead gardens since the 1700s. The same clump, divided and replanted generation after generation, has been growing in some Pennsylvania and New England family gardens for over 200 years. Not the same variety. The same genetic material in the same ground, passed forward across generations as a living heirloom. No seed company involved, no catalog needed, no spring purchase required. The plant simply continues. Groundnut, also called hopness or the American potato, is a perennial vine native to eastern North America that produces edible tubers multiplying underground every season. Indigenous peoples across the eastern seaboard depended on it as a primary food source for thousands of years before European settlement. Early colonial records describe native gardens where groundnut grew alongside other perennials, producing reliable caloric harvests without any annual cultivation. The plants were there before the garden was made and would be there long after. Then European agricultural systems arrived, introduced annual potato cultivation, and the groundnut gradually disappeared from the cultural food knowledge of the people who replaced the communities that depended on it. It is still growing wild along streams and in bottomlands across much of the eastern United States right now. A food plant, productive and nutritious, standing at the edge of forests and fields, completely invisible to people who have been trained to look for food only on store shelves and in seed packets. Perennial kale, specifically the variety called Dobbinton's kale, is a plant that professional market gardeners in Britain have been harvesting continuously from the same plants for 5 and 6 years. It does not flower and set seed like annual kale. It simply keeps producing leaves from the same woody stem, branching wider each season, becoming more productive rather than less as it ages. Cuttings root easily in water, which means a single plant becomes 10 plants without any cost beyond the 15 minutes it takes to put cuttings in a jar. The equivalent of 10 kale seedlings at a garden center costs between $8 and $15 every spring. Dobbinton's kale costs that once, the first year you source a cutting, and then never again for the life of the plant. Globe artichoke is grown as an annual in most American gardens because most American gardeners were never told it is a perennial. In USDA hardiness zones 7 and above, artichoke plants left in the ground over winter die back to the roots and return in spring with stronger, more productive crowns every year. A single artichoke plant properly maintained will produce for 10 years or more, sending up offsets each season that can be divided to expand the planting. The artichoke plant that feeds you in year 1 is the beginning of a planting that feeds you in year 10, not a single season transaction with a seed company. The financial reality of switching even a portion of your garden to perennials is so clear once you run the numbers that it becomes almost frustrating to understand why it is not the default recommendation from every agricultural extension office and garden center in the country. The answer is that garden centers make money on annual sales. Extension offices are funded through channels connected to the agricultural industry that benefits from annual cultivation. The information exists, the research is thorough, and the results are documented across centuries of practice and decades of modern study. It simply never gets amplified by anyone with a financial interest in your attention, because the solution to the problem of expensive, labor-intensive food gardening is cheap, permanent, and unkillable, which makes it worthless as a product and priceless as a practice. Sorrel is a perennial herb that tastes like lemon and grows back every spring from the same roots for 20 years or more. It is one of the first edible plants to emerge after winter, producing tender lemony leaves in March when nothing else in the garden is even thinking about growing yet. French cuisine has used it in sauces and soups for centuries. It disappeared from American gardens almost entirely because it cannot be marketed as a seasonal novelty and because the shelf life of fresh sorrel leaves is poor enough that commercial growers have little interest in it. Grow it yourself, step outside in early March, cut a handful of leaves, and you have something no grocery store in your region is carrying at that moment. That is the kind of food security that perennial planting builds, not just the security of having food, but of having food when nothing else is available. Here is the single most important thing you can do this weekend that costs almost nothing, and that will still be producing food decades from now. Go to any grocery store and buy 1 pound of fresh ginger root. Not ginger powder. Fresh ginger root, the kind with visible growth buds on the surface. Cut it into sections, each with at least 1 bud. Plant those sections 2 inches deep in good soil in the largest container you own or directly in the ground if you are in zone 7 or warmer. Water it and wait. By midsummer, you will have lush tropical foliage. By fall, you will have fresh ginger root that you can harvest partially and replant the remainder. In zones 9 and 10, it overwinters in the ground and returns every year indefinitely. In colder zones, it overwinters in a pot brought inside. The $2 you spent on grocery store ginger becomes a perennial food plant that never needs replacing. That is the entire philosophy of the perennial food garden compressed into one transaction. What did the farmers and gardeners of the pre-industrial world understand that the modern seed industry spent 70 years teaching us to forget? That the most valuable thing you can put in your garden is something that does not need to be bought again. That time invested in soil preparation and perennial planting multiplies in value every year rather than resetting to zero every March. That a garden which knows how to feed itself is infinitely more resilient than one that depends entirely on external inputs arriving by truck every spring. The perennial food garden is not a radical new concept. It is the oldest concept in cultivation, temporarily buried under 60 years of catalog marketing and spring sale events, waiting for someone to remember that plants were here before garden centers and will be here long after the last seed packet is printed. Start with 3 plants this season. Asparagus crowns for the harvest that begins in year 3 and never stops. Comfrey for the free fertilizer that mines your subsoil every 2 weeks for 20 years. And 1 perennial allium, whether walking onion, Welsh onion, or chives, that will expand and divide and feed your household indefinitely from a single clump you plant once before summer. That is a $45 investment at most that pays back every single year for the rest of the time you live in your home. The seed catalog wants you to start over every spring. The perennial garden wants you to understand that the best garden you will ever grow is the one that started the year before last, and the one before that, and the one before that, getting stronger and deeper and more generous with every season it survives without your interference. Tell me in the comments which perennial food plant you are going to try first. I read every single one, and the answer people give surprises me every time.